The gymnasium smelled of fresh paint and old regret. Flashbulbs popped like tiny thunderstorms over a sea of caps and gowns. The plastic of my grandson's sash warmed under my fingers as I ran a thumb over the stitched year and told myself to keep breathing long enough to do what needed doing. A folding chair scraped. Another. The echo stacked itself in the rafters like the memory of voices that stopped calling. I watched the stage lights flare white on polished wood, and in the glare I could almost see the life they said I no longer deserved, sold off in pieces while I slept. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel, and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. My name is Harlan. I'm 67 years old, and this is what really happened. I was not always the man in the front row of a high school gym counting breaths. I owned a small plumbing company 30 miles north of here. 3 trucks with blue stripes, and my name in gold leaf. Harlan and Sons. The and Sons part was a promise I painted before my boy ever turned 10. Back then he rode shotgun with legs too short for the floorboard, asking why copper sang when you tapped it. He leaned in and said years later at my kitchen table, "It's time you slowed down, Dad." He wore a realtor's smile that didn't touch his eyes. My daughter-in-law stood behind him with a calculator in her hand like a priest with a hymnal. I laughed, because I was tired, not weak. My hands could still thread pipe by feel in the dark. I shook my head and pushed the ledger toward him. "I've slowed down. I'm selling 2 trucks, keeping one for emergencies." The page showed neat columns, calls, jobs, a rhythm older than any mortgage. She whispered, "There's a better option." Papers slid across my table in a fan, assisted living brochures, sunlit patios, men my age playing checkers with strangers. "Think of your safety," she added like I was a child near a busy street. He slammed his hand on the desk where we kept the mail. Envelopes jumped. "You wandered off last week," he said. "We looked for you for hours." It had been 20 minutes. I'd gone to the cemetery to talk to Ruth. No one tells you how the dead rearrange your sense of time. I lowered my voice. "I'm not moving." The words sat between us like a wrench too heavy for their hands. Outside, a neighbor's mower droned. Cut grass drifted in. I watched the muscle in my son's jaw jump. My jaw copied and hardened by a life with smoother edges than mine. She didn't blink as she said, "Then we'll have to protect you from yourself." They called my forgetfulness episodes. They called my notes paranoia. The doctor they liked used words that fit on lines my son had already highlighted. Cognitive decline, guardianship placement. He was a kind man in soft shoes who smelled faintly of mint, and I hated the way my son nodded while he spoke, like the verdict had been his to deliver all along. The day they moved me into Brookside Manor, the air tasted like disinfectant and lemon peel. The aide wore cartoon scrubs. My room held a twin bed, a window facing a parking lot, and a laminated sign that misspelled my last name. The night nurse, a woman with tired eyes and a laugh she wore like armor, tucked the blanket tight enough to pin my legs. "You'll get used to it," she said. I smiled so she didn't have to feel bad for lying. I counted the bolts on the bed frame. 8. The ceiling tiles. 24. When the counter ran out, I listened to the rattle of pill carts, to the TV down the hall preaching game shows to nobody, to the cologne of the man in the next room whose children never visited except to sign things. He leaned in and said from the doorway one afternoon, "Heard you used to run crews." He was tall, with knuckles like walnuts. The name tag read Jerry, maintenance. He smelled like Deputy 40 and old coffee. For the first week I kept my words folded up like money. Then he asked me how I'd fix a water hammer that kept singing at 3 a.m. And I talked until lunch went cold. I shook my head when he offered me a job that wasn't a job. "They'll call it therapy," he grinned. "You'll call it keeping your hands." He slid me a pair of thin gloves, the kind they used in the laundry room. "Better grip," she whispered through the phone one night. "My granddaughter, Lila. Mom says they're just organizing these. Don't be mad." Papers shuffled on her end. I could picture my daughter-in-law standing over her, instructing. I asked about my grandson's graduation date instead. Lila told me June gymnasium, streamers. "He asked if you'd be there," she said. I told him yes. He slammed his hand on the newel post of my old staircase in my mind where he now lived more than I did. My son liked to take off his shoes at the door like a visiting saint. The house had a new rug. The scent of my wife's rose soap had been replaced by citrus. The day they brought me to visit, I found a stranger's coffee mug in the sink and an open folder on the counter. The top page was a spreadsheet labeled Assets, Disposition Plan. Yellow cells gleamed like caution lights. I lowered my voice at the kitchen island that knew every Christmas ham I had carved on it. You changed the deed. I had taught him how to read titles when he bought his first car. He had changed the deed on my house into a trust with himself as trustee. The paper smiled in legal language that said he could decide if I needed it. She didn't blink as she said, "It's for tax efficiency." Her mouth tasted like peppermint when she got nervous. I remembered everything that paid for that kitchen, the phone calls at 2 a.m., the burst pipes thawed by my breath when the van's heater died, the winter my wife drove behind me with the hazard lights on so I wouldn't fall asleep and drift into a ditch. They kept bringing me new forms. HIPAA, DNR, power of attorney for convenience. My hands shook when I signed the TV remote out of the nurse's station, but not when I signed my name. I started writing it slower, so they'd think I was tired, not blind. At Brookside I learned the schedule. Pills at 8, chair yoga at 9, food called beef tips at noon that tasted like the memory of stew. In the afternoon I watched the maintenance log fill with requests. Downstairs toilet gurgling, room 112 tap leaking, boiler banging like a drum line. The notes were a language I could still read, and I read everything else too. The fine print on the admission papers, the state ombudsman's phone number stapled to a bulletin board nobody looked at, the policy about. He leaned in and said near the loading dock, "You see this?" Jerry pointed to a rusted expansion tank that had been bleeding for years. "Budget says we patch. Budget forgets water doesn't care about budgets." He laughed and then didn't. He told me about his mother's house. He told me about court papers that made her a line item. He told me he wished men like us wrote the rules. I shook my head at night, when the quiet grew teeth. If I let it, the darkness would swell with voices. So I counted again. Not bolts or tiles this time, but questions. How many signatures did it take to erase a life? How many chair scratches did it take to sound like a gavel? How many times could a son call you buddy before you understood the demotion? She whispered in the hallway, an aide to another, about a resident who had tried to leave. They called it exit-seeking behavior. They called it dangerous. They called the police. I sat on the edge of my bed and gathered the parts of myself that were not paperwork. I pressed them into a stack thicker than any file. He slammed his hand on his briefcase at the dining room table the next week. My son. The briefcase was new. Leather that hadn't learned his shape. "We've decided to list the lake cabin," he said, as if the cabin had asked for this. He had learned to speak in committees. He had learned to make crimes sound like chores. "Just simplifying," he added. I lowered my voice. "Your mother's ashes are in that water." The room didn't breathe. Even my daughter-in-law stopped calculating for a second. The cabin was our first luxury, a cheap one when we bought it, a rectangle of wood that smelled like damp cedar and fish scales. I had fixed every board in it with my own hands. Our children had carved their initials in the dock post. The gouges were still there the last time I checked, dark with lake water. She didn't blink as she said, "We'll have a small ceremony." The word ceremony stuck. They loved ceremonies, birthdays, closings, goodbyes with cake. I started to plan a ceremony of my own quietly, the way I used to trace pipe through walls, listening for the hidden path. The first tool was time. I stopped arguing. I let them narrate me into the role they understood, forgetful, grateful, distant. I nodded at the right moments. I asked for help with tasks I could do asleep. My son relaxed. People let go of the rope when you stop pulling. The second tool was paper. I asked to see my care plan. I asked to review the Brookside contract. I asked for a copy of the trust and the power of attorney. He's very engaged. The social worker wrote, in a note I could read upside down. She smiled like engagement was a quilt square to be applauded. She didn't notice me memorizing names and phone extensions. He leaned in and said in a voice that liked itself, "We can make this easy, Dad." This time it wasn't my son but the banker he brought. A man with hair too perfect for a small town. He brought forms with tabs. He brought a pen that glided like a skater. "Just sign and we'll handle distributions in a way that benefits everyone." Everyone in his mouth was a circle that did not include me. I shook my head and admired the pen. "Smooth," I said. I wrote his name on a napkin from the cafeteria. Nathan L. Preston, Vice President. Titles are maps. Maps show where the rivers of money flow. He didn't like that I was drawing mine. She whispered after he left, nurse with the tired eyes, "You don't have to sign anything you don't want." She leaned on the doorframe. The hallway hum washing over her like rain. My father-in-law lost his farm to papers he didn't understand. She handed me a brochure with a number circled, free legal assistance for seniors. It read. The paper felt warmer than my blanket. He slammed his hand on the phone later that night and then apologized. Jerry again. Sorry, he muttered. This thing drops calls. He had a cousin who knew a clerk at the county recorder. He had time on weekends. He had a truck that still trusted him. If you ever need to look up a deed, he said, say the word. He didn't ask why my eyes looked like a man measuring a room no one else could see. I lowered my voice into the receiver the next afternoon. The legal clinic put me on hold to music that sounded like an elevator pretending to be a church. When the lawyer finally came on, she spoke quickly. Brooklyn vowels in a Midwestern office. I'm Clara, she said. Tell me what they took. I told her about the house, the cabin, the accounts that had new passwords. I told her I wasn't confused. I told her I was tired of the performance my family required from me. She listened like a mechanic. Listen. She didn't blink as she said, after a long silence, this is going to be a climb. But climbs are just a collection of steps. She explained the difference between a springing power of attorney and the kind my son waved like a badge. She explained undue influence. She explained how courts hate to admit they allowed a theft by fountain pen. You need records, she said. Dates, copies, witnesses, and something they don't expect. What people don't expect from a man they've labeled as fading is a memory of details. I began carry a small notebook I bought in the Brookside gift alcove, where they sold crossword books and candy. My handwriting steadied in the way work steadies a man, dates of visit, names on the bottom of forms. The way my son's tie changed when he thought he had won something. The way my daughter-in-law touched her left earlobe every time she lied. He leaned in and said at the barber shop on Tuesdays. Brookside brought us to a place that still had a striped pole. You Harlan from Harlan and Sons? The barber had my company sticker on the side of his water heater. He told me the new house owner had called about a leak under my old kitchen sink. Guy said his father moved to a home. The barber added gossip cutting hair in the air. Said they got a steal. I shook my head and let the scissors whisper. Did he mention the ash box on the mantel? I asked. The barber stopped. No, he said. Some things cannot be discounted. She whispered from the passenger seat when they drove me back after Sunday's out. Lala again. Courage growing. Grandma would hate this. Her fingers traced the seam of the seatbelt. The car smelled like fast food and new leather. In the rearview mirror, my son's eyes waited for approval like a child returning with a report card. I began to see the soft parts under his armor. That is not forgiveness. It is reconnaissance. He slammed his hand on the armrest the day I asked for my medical records. Don't be dramatic, he said. We're helping you. His mouth was tight. He didn't like that the performance had another actor. I lowered my voice in Claire's office 2 days later. Jerry drove me. We called it a field trip. The building was brick that had been cleaned too often. Her desk was metal, no mahogany to soften the edges. She wore flat shoes that didn't apologize for walking fast. We'll petition to suspend his authority, she said, and we'll file a notice with the recorder to cloud any title transfer until the court hears you. The words were like pipe thread compound, messy, necessary, sealing gaps the cold air was. She didn't blink as she said, but there's something else. Your grandson's graduation. You said June? She smiled like a person seeing a stage. People underestimate ceremonies. They concentrate witnesses. They're the one time your family will act like they're proud of you in public. We can do something with that. The plan was not revenge. It was repair made visible. We gathered statements from neighbors who saw me walk 2 miles without forgetting where I was going. From the pharmacist who knew I tracked my pills better than the chart. From the barber who wrote down our Tuesday conversations like they were scripture. Clara found the notary who regretted meeting my son in a parking lot with documents he pretended were urgent for Dad. The notary's stamp had a time on it that put my signature at a bingo hour. He leaned in and said on the phone, out of breath, Grandpa, do you want to sit with the family on stage? My grandson, Evan, his voice still cracked, like the lake ice in March. I pictured him in a borrowed tie, hair refusing to be tamed. They're letting a graduate nominate one person for a legacy seat. He rushed on. I picked you. He didn't know what I was building. He didn't have to. Love creates openings greed overlooks. I shook my head even though he couldn't see it. I'll be there, I said. The words filled the room like warm air. The night nurse looked up from her chart and smiled without asking why my shoulders had finally lowered from around my ears. She whispered, later, The last piece. Clara called and said, "The judge signed the temporary order. It's not the finish, but it's a start." And Harlan, the pause carried weight. "We recorded notice against the house and the cabin. They can't sell without tripping an alarm now." I exhaled through my teeth. It sounded like a valve opening. The line held pressure again. I began to rehearse my steps in the gym where Jerry let me walk at night. He unlocked the back door with a key he wasn't supposed to have, and we pretended we were looking for a leak in the boiler. The air in there smelled like dust and promise. I stood at the center court line and practiced looking up into lights until my eyes stopped flinching. Words that mattered should be spoken without a squint. He slammed his hand on the wheel of his truck when I told him part of what I was going to do. "You sure about this?" Jerry asked. He wasn't insulting me. He was weighing the load like a man tested by Winters. "They'll look small," he warned. "People don't like watching their reflections shrink." I lowered my voice. "I'm not doing this to make them small. I'm doing it so the paperwork stops pretending it knows me better than I do." He nodded. That sentence was a level he could read the bubble on. She didn't blink as she said, "When I met the principal 2 days before the ceremony, 'We're honored to have you speak for a moment, Mr. Carter.'" Her office smelled like dry erase markers and coffee. She wore a lanyard heavy with keys to rooms teenagers tried to hide in. "Evan told us you built your business from nothing," she continued. "We like stories that remind students what hands can do." She slid me a copy of the program. Under legacy address, my name misspelling corrected this time waited. I folded the paper once. Then again. The crease was sharp enough to cut. I looked at the clock. I counted the seconds it took for the second hand to make the turn. Then I listened, because in the hallway a bell rang, and the pattern of feet outside her office shifted to a formal rhythm. It sounded like a march, not a scramble. It sounded like a ceremony learning what it was for. When I stepped out, the gym was open for practice. Chairs stood in rows like teeth. The stage wore a blue skirt that hid its knees. A custodian adjusted a spotlight until it stopped stuttering. I walked to the front row, sat, laid my palm flat on the cool metal. I pictured the other palms that would sit here. Mothers pressing glossed programs, fathers smoothing pants legs, grandparents gripping canes. I pictured my son's face when all his scripts lost their margins. My phone buzzed in my shirt pocket. A new notification from the school app. Evan had installed for me. Speaker check-in. "Please confirm arrival for legacy address." The button asked for yes or no. I looked at my thumbs, old tools that had built kitchens and mended boats, and held a newborn under the blue light of a hospital midnight. I pressed yes. That night, as the wind combed the trees outside Brookside, and the night nurse hummed along to commercial that promised mattresses, I opened my notebook and turned to a fresh page. The title I wrote at the top was not poetry, it was a pipe diagram. Ceremony as courtroom. Under it 3 boxes. Witnesses, documents, exit. When I finished mapping the arrows between them, a shadow moved across my door window. Boots. A pause. Then the handle turned. He leaned in and said from the dark hallway, voice low, "Mr. Carter, you got a minute?" It wasn't Jerry. It wasn't a nurse either. A man in a county badge stepped into the light puddle. He held his hat in his hands the way men do when they'd rather carry a confession. "Name's Deputy Rains," he added. "We had a call." He didn't finish. I shook my head once. Slow. "What kind of call?" My throat felt like a pipe freezing in a crawl space. He lifted a folded paper. "Anonymous tip. Says you're planning to disrupt the graduation." His eyes flicked to my notebook. To the boxes. To the arrows. "They asked us to make sure you wouldn't be allowed inside." The pen in my hand stopped. The radiator hissed. Somewhere down the hall, a game show audience clapped for a prize they could not use. She didn't blink as she said, from the doorway behind him, "That anonymous tip came from a number registered to your son." Clara's silhouette cut the hall's fluorescent blur. She held another paper. The county seal shone like a coin. "I came to bring you something, Harley." She lifted the document into the light. Embossed. Signed. Fine. "Also," she added, and for the first time since we started I heard something like a smile in her voice, "The principal just called my office. Evan nominated you to give the legacy address. The school has you on their program and on their welcome list." Deputy Rains looked between us. He cleared his throat. "Then I'll need to update my notes," he said. "And I guess I'll be there to make sure you get to your seat." I closed the notebook. My thumbs found each other. The page with the boxes felt heavier now, the way pipe does when water starts to move. On the document Clara held, I could see the first line even from my bed. It began, "Order granting temporary restraining relief." The rest would change everything. But the real change had already arrived. As another notification buzzed on my phone, I tapped it open. A message from an unknown number glowed against the dark. "Grandpa." It read, "Don't tell Dad. I got you the mic." The message glowed against the dark like a lit pilot after a storm. Unknown number. 4 words that could carry a whole building. "I got you the mic." He leaned in and said from the hallway, "Deputy Rains again. You good to talk, Mr. Carter?" His hat brim drew a thin shadow across the floor. He smelled like rain on hot pavement, and a long shift that hadn't decided how to end. I shook my head to clear the hum in my chest. "I'm good." My fingers pressed the notebook closed and felt the ridge of the spiral. A small metal spine holding paper together with more loyalty than some family names. She whispered as she stepped closer. "Claire, we file first thing in the morning, then we meet the recorder at 10. Jerry says he can drive." She set the embossed order on my tray table like a nurse. Setting down a tray the kitchen had finally gotten right. The seal caught the fluorescent light. The thing about official paper is that it has a weight you can feel with your eyes. He slammed his hand gently on his notebook to get our attention. Rains nodded at the page title ceremony as courtroom. "If you're walking into a crowd with feelings, let me know where you want me," he said. He'd stood in enough gyms to know how sound becomes wind when people decide what they think of you. I lowered my voice. "Front row. Aisle seat. I want my son to see me stand up from his angle." I looked past them to the window. The parking lot lights carved the rain into silver lines, and I want a clear path to the stage. She didn't blink as she said, "You'll have it." Then Clara held up a thin folder with tabs. "This is the ledger. Not numbers no one understands. 1 page per asset. Date. Act. Authority claimed. Authority revoked. QR in the corner goes to the recorded notice. Even a man who wants to misread it will trip over the bold print." The next morning, Brookside smelled like burnt toast and lemon cleaner. Wheels whispered over linoleum. A game show laughed at a woman guessing the price of a freezer she didn't need. Jerry rolled up in his truck with the passenger door that squealed like a tired violin. He wore a shirt with his name stitched in blue and a grin he didn't make you earn. He leaned in and said as he helped me into the seat, "You ever think you'd be running supply like this again?" He tapped the folder on my lap. "Paper instead of pipe." I shook my head, felt the seatbelt catch. "Pipe only leaks where you can test it," I said. "Paper leaks where you think you're dry." The truck smelled like coffee and metal shavings. A washer rolled in the cup holder with each turn, clicking like a metronome for men who work with hands. She whispered directions from the GPS on Jerry's cracked phone until we reached the county building that pretended to be smaller by using glass. Inside, the recorder's office hummed like a muffled hive. The clerk behind the counter wore a sweater that had survived 3 administrations and a patience that had seen worse. She shaped each stamp like a little thunderclap. He slammed his hand, not angry, just firm on the stack to square it. The clerk aligned the forms against the desk edge, tapped them until the corners behaved, and looked at me over the rims of her glasses. "In feet of it, of revocation as to power of attorney," she read. "Order granting temporary restraining relief." Her mouth tightened in a way that wasn't unfriendly. "People try this too late," she added. "Glad you came before the auction flyers." I lowered my voice. "Thank you for believing a man who knows his own name." I watched the red ink bloom. The seal slid down with a sure slap that said this copy would outlive opinions. She didn't blink as she said, "Lis Pendens recorded against parcel 1803-14-2 and 1809-2002. She rotated the screen so I could see. The map lines were clean. The small rectangle that was my house. The long thin slice that was our dock punching into the lake like a stubborn finger. "Anyone who tries to sell now will meet this first," she warned. There was satisfaction in her voice, but not cruelty. Public record is a kind of honesty too blunt for dinner tables. Outside, the air tasted like hot asphalt and paper dust. Jerry exhaled a laugh that had been waiting since the first stamp. He slapped the truck roof with his palm. "You hear that?" he said. "That's the sound of something actually holding TAF." It was just wind moving past a downtown that had stopped pretending it wasn't old, but I heard it too. He leaned in and said at our next stop, the print shop that still kept a bell on the door, 50 sets, cardstock, single staple top left. The woman at the counter didn't ask what we were printing that needed to survive hands. The machine breathed out warm stacks. The toner smelled like a small fire. You wanted to watch? Each page came alive with black blocks that even a bad light couldn't fade. I shook my head when I saw the QR square in the corner. Kids will scan it, Jerry grinned. Parents too, if you tell them there's a video. He wasn't wrong. A phone ring can cut through ritual faster than a hymn. She whispered over lunch at Claire's office. Coffee. The cheap kind. Good because it tried hard. The school called again. The principal's solid. But the district council has concerns. She didn't say pressure. She didn't have to. When money meets embarrassment, it hires someone to say concern. He slammed his hand on the edge of Claire's metal desk lightly. Let them be concerned, I murmured. I've been concerned for months, and did not get to hire a mouth to carry it. The words weren't pretty. They didn't need to be. My wife used to tease me that I only get poetic when it's time to buy a new wrench. I lowered my voice when Clara put the next piece on the table. Envelopes, thick, cream, with each name written in her neat print. Son, daughter-in-law, banker, notary, title company, repot, even pastor, because my son liked to frame thievery as stewardship in rooms with stained glass. You will hand each of them their page when you call them up, she said. To refuse it in front of witnesses is to confess the fear that keeps courts awake. She didn't blink as she said. And one more. Grandson. She slid a thinner envelope, not cream but plain white, stamped with the school crest. Inside, a certificate from the Legacy Mentor program the principal had invented around us. We'll give that one first, Clara added, anchored the ceremony in truth. That evening, Brookside's dining room aired out Meatloaf and Loneliness. The old men argued over a baseball game from 3 seasons back as if changing the score on memory could alter a league table somewhere. The night nurse shook her head and smiled at me when I asked if I could use the quiet room after visiting hours. You earned it, she said. Just don't steal the markers. They cost more than your first truck. He leaned in and said in a whisper, thicker than a boy's should be. Evan in the doorway. Hoodie zipped, hair refusing duty. I used my friend's phone earlier. He looked down at his sneakers. The rubber squeaked once against the tile. Dad checks my... I shook my head and tried to keep my voice steady enough for him to stand on. You didn't do anything wrong by loving me, I said. His eyes lifted. In them, the lake, the dock, the skinny kid I taught to hold a flashlight so the beam stayed on the valve and not the spider web. She whispered like confession. They said you get confused. His hands fidgeted with the lanyard that held a gym key. AV Club stamped on plastic. They said you signed things and then forgot. Grandpa, you taught me to sign my name neat. I don't think you forget on paper. He slammed his hand gently into a fist and then let it go. I can get you the handheld mic, the one they bring for awards. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small case. Inside, a lapel mic slept like a silver beetle. This one pairs to the board without needing the stage box. The sound guy never locks it. I lowered my voice, not to keep a secret from him, but to keep the moment from cracking. You're asking me to be the noise your father can't ignore, I said. He swallowed, nodded. Love makes traitors of us in the directions that matter. She didn't blink as she said from behind him the principal, who had walked him in and waited at the corner where staff pretend to be invisible. Mr. Carter, the program is tight. 4 minutes for the legacy address. She raised a hand as I opened my mouth. I know. I also know microphones can feel longer or shorter depending on who is holding them. The smile that followed was not unkind. Please don't make me regret this. The day before graduation, the house that used to be mine wore a new patio set like borrowed jewelry. I saw it from the street as Jerry idled at the curb. A realtor's sign leaned against the porch like it had been told to wait for the ink. The maple we planted the year my son was born had a rope swing. No one had hung there while Ruth lived. Rope creaked. So did something inside my chest that remembered the exact sound of her laugh when Wind tried to steal her hat. He leaned in and said through the open window, my son coming down the steps in a shirt that called itself casual, and a jaw that called itself certain. Dropping by without an invite now? He looked at Jerry, misread him as a driver. He looked at me like a man assessing a tool he'd been told was past warranty. I shook my head slowly. Had to see how the paint held. I leaned my arm on the window frame the way I had 1,000 times. You went with eggshell, I added. Goes chalky when the sun's angry. She whispered from the doorway, my daughter-in-law into her phone. Yes, we can move the closing up if the title company is comfortable. She saw me, turned. Oh, she said. You. He slammed his hand on his thigh like a coach calling time. We'll talk after the ceremony. My son said, no need to make a scene. The word scene left a stain in the air. I lowered my voice. That's exactly where we disagree, I said. I learned to work in the open. You learn to hide theft behind appointments. Jerry's chuckle rumbled low like an idling compressor. My son colored. He held the door too long. Courtesy is theater. She didn't blink as she said, as we drove off, he acts like he's already sold it. Jerry shook his head hard enough to pop something in his neck. Paper says otherwise now, he added. Let him learn the taste of a no with an official seal. That night the nursing home administrator, the one who wore cardigans like policies, asked to see me. Her office smelled like paper clips and orange tea. Diplomas framed the kind of competence that knows where to put a binder. He leaned in and said, folding his hands, Mr. Carter, we have a potential safety issue tomorrow. He chose words like a man choosing stones to skip across a pond. Flat, smooth, hoping to reach the other side without sinking. Transitions are hard. Crowds can be dysregulating. I shook my head. Patience thinned. Crowds are witnesses, I said. That makes them safer than empty halls. I set the deputy's card on her desk. I have an escort. I have a doctor's note you tried to ignore when it said I don't need sedation for agitation. You've misread me because people like the story where old men are small, she whispered to her credit. Our liability carrier. Then she stopped. She saw I was already standing. Sometimes the only argument left is the walk out of a room. He slammed his hand on the dash the morning of. Not angry. Jerry checking the clock. We're early, he said. The sky had bleached itself trying to be polite. Streamers in school colors fluttered across the gym entrance like ribs. The parking lot smelled like dust and hairspray. Parents carried bouquets and a new nervousness about the future. I lowered my voice to Evan when he jogged up in his gown, mortarboard bobbing. You keep your eyes on your row, I told him. Let me carry the weight that has my name on it. He nodded. His face had started to learn the muscles it would use when he had to keep promises. She didn't blink as she said, Deputy Rains, now in a neatly pressed uniform that had a different gravity than his jacket. I spoke with the principal. I'm posted right here at the aisle. You go up when they call you. If anyone puts a hand out that doesn't belong, I'll move it. He patted the radio on his shoulder like a friend with good hearing. In the lobby, the principal handed me a program. My name under legacy address, 4 minutes between valedictorian remarks and presentation of diplomas. The paper was thicker than the ones they hand out at school plays. I folded it, slid it inside my jacket next to the envelopes. I could feel the thick cream press my ribs. That weight steadied me more than handrails. He leaned in and said, near the soundboard, a man with a lanyard full of keys, hair gray and attitude gray. You Harlan? He didn't wait for yes. Evan told me you might need a clean channel. He flicked a switch. The monitors hummed alive. He handed me the handheld mic for stage and the lapel for insurance. Batteries fresh, he said. No one cuts a feed I'm running unless they brought better wire cutters than I've seen. I shook my head and smiled. If this goes sideways, I said, play the national anthem and blame me for covering my heart too long. He snorted. Son, I've watched boosters turn a bake sale into a coup d'etat. A graduation speech is a picnic. She whispered in my ear as the lights dimmed. The night nurse, who had come and taken a seat in the back row on her own time, breathed with the band. I hadn't seen her slip in. She patted my shoulder. When the brass inhales, you do too. The band struck the opening march. Folding chairs scuffed the floor in unison. The gymnasium really did smell like fresh paint and old regret. Camera flashes stitched stars into the rafters. The stage curtain rustled like a patient waking up. He slammed his hand, not violently, but with a father's claim on the back of the chair in front of me. My son leaned over the aisle. Let's not do this, he hissed. His cufflinks winked under the lights. Little polished lies. You'll embarrass yourself. I lowered my voice. I've been embarrassed on my own time for months, I said. Today I share the cost. Deputy Rains straightened just enough to remind my son that his jurisdiction didn't end at family discomfort. My son swallowed the rest of the sentence like a bad pill. She didn't blink as she said the names. The principal. Calling each graduate, her voice found a rhythm that made strangers root for other people's children. Evan's name approached like a whistle. You hear before you see the train. He walked like his shoes had decided to behave. He shook hands. He looked for me. I lifted a thumb. Sometimes support is just a small sign a boy can spot in a crowd. Now, the principal said into the mic, we'd like to honor a legacy. The room shifted. That subtle lean when a gym searches for a face it's been told to clap for. I felt the seat under my hands. The metal was cool. Sure. He leaned in and said at the end of the row. Another man, suit too shiny, smile too ready. Mr. Carter? He blocked my path with a nervousness wrapped in politeness. I'm counsel for the district. There's been a change. I shook my head slowly. Not today, I said. I took a step. He took one too. Deputy Rain's hand hovered. A warning his badge would sign if needed. She whispered as she slid between us. The principal. Eyes hard now. Excuse us. She held a new stack of programs. The papers still warm from the copier. The top sheet faced up. The legacy address line was gone. He slammed his hand on his briefcase where he'd been perched along the wall. Nathan the banker. Like he'd just scored a point. No one else had seen. My daughter-in-law's smile sharpened. My son's shoulders loosened in a relief that smelled like victory bought with a phone call. I lowered my voice because screaming in a gym makes you smaller. You reprinted the program. It wasn't a question. On whose order? She didn't blink as she said, voice low. The superintendent took a call from a law firm 15 minutes ago. They cited potential liability. They threatened an injunction they couldn't actually get in an hour. But fear rarely checks the clock. She looked at the mic in my hand, then at the lapel in my pocket. I can stall, she added. I cannot give you the stage if the district says no on their insurance. He leaned in and said from just behind my shoulder, Evan. Eyes wide, mouth set. The mic still works from the floor, and the projector will play whatever I tell it to. I already cued the slide with the cue off. He tilted his cap toward the sound booth where the lanyard man gave a single slow nod. I shook my head once, a prayer to a woman whose ashes still brushed the dock posts when the lake got loud. Ceremony as courtroom, I murmured. But the judge just left the bench. The band vamped, unsure. The crowd rustled, programs crinkling like foil. A baby cry. Somewhere, someone laughed at something that wasn't funny. The smell of carnations warmed under the lights until it turned to sugar. He slammed his hand, the district counsel against his own tie to straighten it. Please return to your seat, Mr. Carter, he said into a smile that could be photographed. We'll proceed. I lowered my voice to Deputy Rains. You still with me? He didn't nod. He didn't need to. He adjusted his stance so the aisle belonged to us. She didn't blink as she said. Clara suddenly there, weaving through bodies with a grace that only long practice gives. They've gone ex-parte on guardianship. She held up a phone screen. A docket entry glowed. Emergency hearing set for Monday. But they'll use the petition as a scarecrow today. And Harlan, her eyes lifted to the stage where the principal waited helpless. The district just texted me an order from their counsel. If you approach the stage, they'll cut power to the board. The sound man froze, hands hovering above sliders. He looked at me. He looked at Evan. He looked at the man in the shiny suit who had never carried a monitor up a flight of metal stairs. The principal stepped back from the podium, as if someone had told her the wood was hot. The big screen behind her flickered once, blue to black to blue. The lanyard man's jaw set. Evan swallowed. The baton hung in the band director's hand like a question. And right then, the new program's fresh printed worm fell from a row of parents' laps in a simultaneous accidental scatter. Pages fanned across the aisle at my feet. Every copy carrying the same white space where my name had been. Grandpa, Evan whispered, voice trembling into resolve. They erased you. He was wrong about one thing. I wasn't erased. I was about to become impossible to ignore. The handheld mic hummed alive in my palm on a channel no one expected, and the projector, obedient to the AV kid who loved me more than a program, suddenly brightened with a slide that bore one line in heavy black and a square that begged to be scanned. Public ledger asset reversal filed and recorded. Then, as the first phones lifted like birds, every light in the gym went out. Dark washed over the gym the way lake water rolls over a dock fast, cold, swallowing edges first. 100 small sounds rose at once. Metal chair feet ticking like rain. A child protesting the sudden night. The breathy laugh of someone who laughs when they're scared. The emergency lights popped in a heartbeat later, low and red, turning faces into half-moons and making the new paint look like damp brick. He leaned in and said from 2 rows back, the lanyard man voice low into his headset. Board's dead. House power cut. But handheld is on a battery pack. Channel 3 is yours if you keep your thumb on it. His outline became a moving shadow. Cables looped across his shoulder like climbing rope. I shook my head to clear the surge of memories that try to flood you when darkness invites them. I'm still here, I said into the mic. The sound carried clean and eerie in the red light. And so is the ledger. Phones lifted. Screens lit. A galaxy waking. She whispered by my ear as she pressed something into my free hand. Clara. Appearing in the dark with the ease of a woman who has walked worse corridors. It's the notarized copies. Give them in this order. Her finger tapped the stack. Son, daughter-in-law, banker, notary, title rep, pastor. Every page references the recording number. They can run but their signatures cannot. He slammed his hand on the aisle seat to push himself up. Deputy Raines, posture wide, hat brim a slice of night. Keep moving, Mr. Carter, he said, not to rush me but to rescue the aisle from second thoughts. He looked at the district council hovering like a stop sign without a pole. Sir, step back. I lowered my voice and stepped forward. The red lights made the gym feel like a boiler room. I knew well. In my palm the mic thrummed like a small machine that remembered its job even when power forgot it. Evan, I said, not turning. Slide 1. She didn't blink as she said from the stage, the principal's voice steady without the PA. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We have emergency lighting. Calm rearranged itself along the bleachers like a row of dominoes deciding not to fall. The screen at the back, fed by a projector the lanyard man had run off a rolling UPS meant for server racks, brightened from blue to white to black letters, big enough for the far corners to squint and make sense of. Public ledger asset reversal, filed and recorded. Under it the QR square sat like a small door. In the sea of lifted phones you could hear the little chime that means a camera recognized an invitation. He leaned in and said beside my ear, my son, trying for a whisper that came out like a hiss. You will stop right now. His cologne cut through paint and carnations. It belonged to someone who sold coastal condos to people who would fill them with furniture that didn't learn their shape. I shook my head and kept my feet aimed at the spill of emergency light pooling at the stage steps. Option to stop expired, I said, not to win, but to keep my knees from locking. Slide 2, I added. She whispered into her handheld principal to stage crew, house to backup route. Open rear curtain. Give him room. The edge of the stage skirt lifted, revealing tangle and tape and a clear square on the floor as if someone had swept a path through wire. He slammed his hand on his briefcase. Nathan the banker, paper edges coughing out of the top like white tongues. This is illegal, he declared to the dark. He aimed it at the district council like a flare. Confidential financial information. I lowered my voice. Confidential until recorded, I said, holding up the ledger page with its stamped number catching the red glow. We filed this morning. The court's temporary order is public. Your memo telling my son to move the cabin proceeds through an escrow outside county. Failed when the recorder put a cloud on title big enough to cast shade over your week. The audience doesn't always understand terms, but they understand tone. The word cloud made heads tilt. People know what a sky does before rain does it. She didn't blink as she said from 3 rows over. A woman I didn't know, program fanned in her hand. Scan it, Lou. Her husband maybe lifted his phone. The chime pinged again. It's real, he announced like a man reading a scoreboard. Evan advanced the slide. Did history appeared. Dates like rungs. Names like footprints. The arrow that should have ended at my son's trust now wore a red slash across it with a caption in Clara's print. Notice of pending action recorded 10:13 a.m. The time mattered. Narrative is a lock that opens with precise teeth. He leaned in and said sharper now. My son, Dad, you are confused. He doesn't have capacity. You all need to know that. He tried to sound like a caregiver. He sounded like a man whose ladder had missed a rung. I shook my head and let the next envelope find my fingers. Capacity, I said into the mic. Each syllable a valve turning, is a word the law uses carefully. I faced the bleachers. Faces glowed ghostly in screens. If I were incompetent, this judge. I lifted the stamped order so the seal flashed red would not have signed this temporary relief and suspension of my son's authority this morning. If I were confused, I would not have 30 neighbors' affidavits, a barber's log, a pharmacist's chart, and an ombudsman on speed dial. Confusion is noisy. Preparation is quiet. She whispered from behind me, the night nurse, voice like a soft towel. He eats at noon. He remembers every nurse's name. He fixed the laundry room sink with a plastic spoon and a shoelace. People turned. She shrugged. We measured competence raw. He slammed his hand across his chest like a preacher taking a breath. Pastor Dell, who had christened my children and buried my wife. We do not put families to shame, he intoned. His tone tried to bless the moment back into manners. I lowered my voice. Families put themselves there when they mistake inheritance for entitlement. I didn't look at him because looking would remind me of the casseroles he brought when Ruth died. And I needed my knees today. "Pastor, please step forward. Your envelope." He hesitated, then came. He took the paper. He read the line that noted his letter, on church letterhead, falsely stating I had agreed to a transfer in the spirit of stewardship. He closed his eyes. His hand shook. "I will correct the record," he said, voice smaller, truer. She didn't blink as she said, "Clara," now on the center line, voice clean. "Mr. Preston." The banker stiffened like a man in dress shoes on black ice. "Inside your envelope is a copy of your email advising the use of a nominee trust in another county to avoid the list pendants you anticipated." A murmur rolled like a small wave. "You can explain the phrase avoid notice to your compliance officer. He already has a copy." Phones turned his way the way sunflowers turn to sun. Evan advanced the slide again. Notary log. A timestamp that sat exactly on a Tuesday bingo hour. A selfie the notary had posted to her business page, ring light in her pupils. A caption, "Late-night emergency signatures for a sweet family. Anything for clients." The room made a sound people make when they recognize the shape of a lie. He leaned in and said from the edge of the bleachers, the notary herself, who had been invited by my daughter-in-law for the photo op. "That's out of context." Her voice wobbled. "I have a book." I shook my head. "Books are good. Books have pages." I held up a printout. Clara had obtained. "Your journal shows you notarized my signature in the facility day room. Brookside's visitor log shows you never checked in." The night nurse lifted a hand without smiling. "Your stamp," I continued, "bled through to the second page where my name is spelled wrong in the signature line. I let the room have the image. I have spelled my name correctly through frostbite in funerals. I did not forget it on a Tuesday." She whispered at my left shoulder, "Principal." Eyes flitting between us and the back hallway where the custodian fiddled with breakers. "Power company says we have a feeder issue. 5 to 10 minutes. She paused. "Do you need them, Mr. Carter?" I lowered my voice. "No," I said. "We have enough light for truth." It sounded grander than I like to sound. But sometimes air needs a sentence stiff enough to hang attention on. He slammed his hand on his program to fold it sharp. "District Council. This is a graduation, not a deposition," he snapped. He stepped in front of me as if to block a doorway that had always been public. I shook my head and took one step sideways, then another. In my years under crawl spaces, I learned that sometimes progress is a low shuffle past things that want to snag your jacket. "You're right," I said. "A deposition is private. This is a ceremony, and I am making what was stolen ceremonial to return." She didn't blink as she said into her phone, "Someone's aunt." Maybe voice excited. "Scan it. It's on a county site. It's real." The QR codes fired like little beacons. The ledger opened across town on couches and car dashboards, and the back pew of a church where a live stream had been projected on a wall for elderly deacons who preferred air conditioning to folding chairs. The truth left the gym and went walking. He leaned in and said from the aisle, "Reigns. Names," he suggested softly. He had seen crowds respond to patterns. "Call them like awards." I lowered my voice and lifted the first envelope. "Special recognition," I said, and let the mic carry the words into the red light. "For exemplary use of guardianship paperwork in pursuit of personal benefit. My son." I did not look at him until he had to stand to make the walk. He did not take 3 steps before someone he sold a house to last summer recognized him and decided to document the moment. She didn't blink as she said, daughter-in-law at his side, "We will not participate." She held her chin high as a maneuver that had worked at charity luncheons. He slammed his hand out to block me. When I extended the envelope, the paper touched his palm. That was enough. "You've been served in the moral sense," someone muttered behind us, and the laugh that followed broke the tensions back for a second. I shook my head. Inside is a copy of the temporary order and the notice recorded against the properties. "Do not attempt to sell them. Do not attempt to encumber them. Do not attempt to represent me as incompetent. The court will hear evidence Monday. In the meantime," I raised my voice a notch, "return my keys after the ceremony." She whispered from behind the banker, "Claire again. Title rip." A man in a blazer like a borrowed language flinched. "Your email chain accepting a rush close without homeowner presence is attached," she said. "Exade your general counsel. He will explain to you on Tuesday why industry standard is not a spell that undoes law." He leaned in and said as the emergency lights flickered once. Evan, urgency sharpening. Grandpa, play the audio. Slide 4 was a black bar with a triangle. Clara had pulled call recordings from a helpful assistant who had thought she was doing her job too well. I nodded. I shook my head toward the sound booth in a signal we hadn't rehearsed, and yet had always known how to read. The lanyard man tapped his phone to the board. The gym filled with a tinny recording like a memory, wearing a cheap suit. My daughter-in-law's voice crisp as peppermint. We need to push Dad's transfer through before the holidays, she said to someone at a bank. He's been wandering. It's better for him if we control the accounts. He forgets. Then my son's voice, softer, calculated to sound reluctant. It's in his best interest, he won't even know. Silence in a gym feels like the air holding its own breath. This wasn't that banned phrase people use when they run out of better writing. This was the kind where people remember how sounds feel on skin. She didn't blink as she said, Pastor, voice steady now, children sit. They did. Stiff as statues that think posture is absolution. He slammed his hand against the back row bleacher to steady himself. An older man I didn't know. My boy did this to me, he announced. Not to hijack, but because hearing your own story out loud breaks something open that prefers to stay shut. The murmurs weren't a mob, they were a congregation of the unwilling. I lowered my voice. This is not a lynching, this is a ledger. I kept the words short. The room needed rails to hold. Evan advanced to slide 5. A simple line. Order, temporary relief granted. Beneath it, the judge's scrawl. Not my son's. Not the banker's. Not the notary's. Someone none of us had ever shared a casserole with, which is sometimes the only kind of objectivity you get. Lights snapped back on with a thud, and a collective blink. The gym soaked in color like a photo, where it had a sky. Somewhere near the back, the superintendent exhaled a relief that smelled like policy returning. The board crackled, the big speakers coughed, and a tinny feedback whine tried to ruin the moment and failed. He leaned in and said, triumphant too early, District Council, we're back on program. He reached for the house mic like a man claiming a hammer he didn't know how to swing. I shook my head and lifted my battery-fed handheld an inch. We never left, I said. The audience laughed, kind with me, not at me. The principal stepped forward, her gaze fierce now, not because she hated risk but because she hated bullies more. She didn't blink as she said into the live mic, Mr. Carter, you may take 2 additional minutes. The room applauded because permission delivered late still feels like water to a man who has walked too long with sand in his teeth. He slammed his hand on his knee, my son finally standing without the urge to posture, just the urge to salvage. Dad, he began, the word duller now, you're hurting me. He looked small because shame shrinks when light finds it. I lowered my voice. Hurt isn't the same as harm, I said, and harm isn't the same as consequence. I held up the last envelope. This one is for me. I opened it. Inside, a single brass key on a school blue ribbon. Evan's work, and a photocopy of the house key I hadn't held in months. The paper version made the real one possible. She didn't blink as she said, to no one and everyone. Proceed with diplomas. The principal lifted her chin. The band found the march. Ritual asserted itself not to erase but to resume after an adjustment. I stepped sideways to the edge of the aisle, as the first line of caps and gowns began again. I did not leave. I stood where my grandson could see me whenever he looked left, and where my son had to pass within arm's length and feel the draft of what accountability actually is. Halfway through the daz, a new sound threaded the hall. A printer fast, hungry, spitting pages from a mobile cart the lanyard man had wheeled out from somewhere. He posted a sign on it with black tape, need a copy of the order. Take one. It wasn't heroic. It was administrative. It was perfect. He leaned in and said, jaw tight as he brushed by me in his section's slow shuffle, Nathan, you'll regret making this public. It was the voice of a man who had never fought a thing he couldn't invoice. I shook my head. Public is where mold dies, I said. He flinched because he'd been in basements. He knew, she whispered as she slipped a folded note into my hand. Night nurse, 2 social workers from Adult Protective Services in the back. They came on their own. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. Systems had ears tonight. The last names hit W. Caps sailed. The air smelled like cheap hairspray and hope. The confetti cannon someone donated misfired and threw ribbons toward the scaffolding, where they hung like proud mistakes. The applause felt less like noise and more like air returning to a body. He slammed his hand on my shoulder. Not rough, not soft. Evan, diploma in his other hand. His eyes were red the way lake water makes them when wind wins. Legacy seat still counts, he said. Even if the program forgot. He lifted the house key on the ribbon. It flashed school blue and brass. I closed my fingers over it, as if it were warm. I lowered my voice into the mic for the last time. Graduates, I said. You've been patient. A chuckle fluttered. You'll have days when paper thinks it can tell you who you are. Write your name cleaner than any stamp that tries to cover it. And when ceremony asks you to clap for something that smells wrong, remember, ceremony belongs to the people who show up prepared. She didn't blink as she said softly, "The principal, thank you." It wasn't for the speech. It was for holding the line she wanted to hold and couldn't without someone first being loud enough to make it safe. The band swelled. The crowd poured out into heat and late afternoon glare. Under the bleachers near the door where athletes hid from pep rallies, Nathan argued on his phone. The words compliance, internal, and mitigation leaked from him like steam from a pinhole. The notary sat on the edge of the stage and stared at her stamp as if it had betrayed her. Maybe it had only told the truth. Deputy Raines posted by the exit that led to the staff lot. He watched the way you watch insects, hands out of pockets, eyes generous. "You got a plan for the parking lot?" he asked when I reached him. "Men like your son don't like losing indoors." He leaned in and said before I could answer, "Jerry," showing up with the truck idling and a grin that had brought more old boilers back from the edge than most warranties. "Plan's the same as always. Don't let a man push you into a choke point." He angled the truck so my side faced open air. He looked past me at my son and lifted his chin a millimeter. The message traveled like electricity through a wet glove. "Not today." I shook my head and turned back toward the gym one last time. The lanyard man raised a thumb from the booth. The principal spoke to a woman whose badge said superintendent with a face that had prepared for complaints and met something else. The night nurse dabbed her eyes and then laughed at herself. Pastor Dell stood by the copy cart taking one of the orders like communion. She whispered, somewhere behind my ribs, the soft voice I carry when I can't carry anything else. "Ruth. That'll do." It didn't make me cry. It steadied my heel for the next step. He slammed his hand on the hood of Jerry's truck just as I reached for the handle. My son, face pale under a tan he paid for. "You're not going anywhere with that key," he said. His breath came quick. Rage runs out of air faster than work. I lowered my voice. "You have a choice," I said. "You can come home with me and put my possessions where I tell you to put them. Or you can follow your lawyer to court and learn to sit in the gallery." I opened the passenger door. The hinge squealed in a way that made me think of every gate I'd ever oiled. She didn't blink as she said behind him, "Claire." "Harlan." A moment. She held her phone where only I could see the text glowing. It was from a number labeled Judge's Clerk. The message was 6 words long, a sentence carved in ice. "Monday hearing moved to this afternoon." The air around the truck changed, as if weather had decided to edit. Evan's hand tightened on my shoulder. Nathan stopped talking and started listening to the silence his own phone had just made. The notary looked like a person seeing a cresting wave with her name on it. The superintendent's mouth formed the word courthouse. Deputy Raines adjusted his hat brim like a salute to inevitability. And from the far end of the lot a siren wound down into a purr as an unmucked sedan rolled in. A woman stepped out in a navy suit that didn't need shine to have authority. She carried a thin case in a walk that made space without asking. "Mr. Carter?" she called. Voice clear enough to cut the leftover static the speakers hadn't quite quit. "I'm Assistant Attorney General Flores. If your family is finished with stalling tactics, I have questions under oath." The courthouse breathed like an old animal, air conditioners wheezing through vents that had learned to nag, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly, floor wax holding the scent of 1,000 polished mornings. Marble chilled my palm as we took the steps 2 at a time because the elevator had decided to sulk. Deputy Raines kept half a stride behind me, a steady shadow with a radio that hissed once, and then went respectful. Jerry's boots knocked a worker's rhythm even here, the sound of a man who won't apologize for being built to carry. He leaned in and said at the landing, "You good?" His breath carried coffee and the ghost of a cinnamon roll he swore he didn't buy. I shook my head once to loosen the tightness at the base of my skull. "I'll be good when I can smell my own hallway again," I answered. The words were simple. They held. She whispered on the 3rd floor. Clara Judge Manetti took the calendar apart. "We're first." She handed me a slip of paper with the case number. Ink smeared on my thumb like a small bruise. "He's prickly," she added. "But he hates shortcuts that pretend to be law." He slammed his hand on the courtroom door. Not rough, just a knock that said we respected thresholds. The bailiff opened from inside, shoes soft, eyes measuring. People drifted to pews carved before my son was born. The benches creaked their opinion. I lowered my voice at counsel table. "Evan," I said, "you sit behind me. Don't talk unless the judge asks. And if your father looks at you like the world is your fault, look at the flag instead." My grandson nodded. The tassel on his mortarboard brushed his ear. He hadn't had time to change. The felt smelled like heat and gym dust and a boy who had held his ground. She didn't blink as she said her name for the record. Distant Attorney General Flores. The title landed like a stamp. "We appear on behalf of the state's interest in elder exploitation and not yet as a party," she clarified, but with leave to question. Her suit made a whisper sound when she moved that reminded me of good paper. The judge settled. He wore the air of a man who had canceled a tea time and wanted those lost minutes to be worth it. "Call it," he ordered without looking up. Claire arose. "Petitioner seeks temporary suspension of agent's authority under power of attorney. Revocation of recent transfers and protective orders. New evidence attached." She moved without ornament, like a person installing a fixture she knew the studs for. He leaned in and said from the other side, "My son's lawyer, a man I hadn't met." His tie looked expensive but tired. "We object to the state's intrusion, to the late filing, to the theatrics at a school function." I shook my head at the list. The theatrics were necessary because theft enjoys quiet, I said into the microphone that smelled like Lysol and old arguments. The judge's eyes flicked up. He did not admonish me. He just watched, which is sometimes permission in robes. She whispered as she slid exhibits onto the rail. Claire recorder's stamp, notary log, bank emails, Brookside contract, ombudsman notes. Paper made a soft, decisive sound each time it met wood. The rhythm felt like progress, tuning itself. He slammed his hand on his pad to stop his pen from tapping. "Judge Minetti, we're not trying liability today," he said. "We're triaging harm." He turned to me. "Mr. Carter, capacity is the axis. Can you tell me your full name, birth date, and the current president?" His tone wasn't cruel. It was the tone of a man who has seen too many families take advantage of a fog and needed to be sure he wasn't joining them. I lowered my voice and answered clean. "Harlan Joe Carter, February 3, 1958. And whoever keeps forgetting that power isn't an heirloom." It got a few coughs from the gallery. The judge's mouth twitched. "That'll do," he allowed. More importantly, he flicked fingers at my bundle. "Explain, in your own words, why you know what these papers do." She didn't blink as she said from the witness bench. The night nurse who had come and who had apparently sat under subpoena faster than I knew subpoenas could travel. He reads his med schedule backward when I try to test him. He inventories the laundry by smell. He knows the last names of every aide on nights and their children's grade levels. She folded her hands. "If he is confused, so am I. And I am not." He leaned in and said with slick patience, "Nathan the banker. Judge, banking decisions were made in the ordinary course with the agent acting within the scope of authority." He smiled like a brochure. "This court should not chill dutiful children." I shook my head and let Clara take that one. "The court should chill self-dealing dressed in Sunday clothes," she said crisply. Exhibit H. Email suggesting use of a nominee trust in a neighboring county to avoid any less pending surprises. Exhibit J. Transcript of a call in which the agent states, "He won't even know." Exhibit L. Title company rep admitting homeowner presence was optional if we're fast. Her finger landed on each tab lightly, nails unpainted. Calm like a wrench fitting true. She didn't blink as she said, "A woman from the recorder's office. Hair in a tight bun that meant she liked things aligned. We treated petitioner's notice like any other. It was indexed at 10:13 a.m. against parcels ending 14-2. Any grantee searching after 10:13 would see it." She looked at my son. "If they searched at all." He slammed his hand on the witness chair arm as he sat. My son more rattled than rehearsed now. "I was trying to protect my father," he said. The lie came out wearing the wrong shoes. He wandered. He left the stove on. He stopped because the judge had lifted one eyebrow and because Evan behind me had moved just enough that a tassel swished like a metronome reminding liars they were offbeat. I lowered my voice. "I left the stove on once in 1993, when your mother's sister called to say the twins were early." I said. "The pancakes burned. The pan lived." The courtroom chuckled without permission. Laughter disinfects certain kinds of raw. She didn't blink as she said from counsel table. Assistant AG Flores. Your Honor, the state will have a charging decision within days regarding the notary and potentially the banker. Today we ask only that the court lock the doors to further harm, temporary orders, return of keys, freeze on accounts, and a directive to Brookside prohibiting chemical restraint without a physician's specific order, unrelated to family convenience. Her voice snapped at that last phrase. Someone in the back row murmured approval that sounded like somebody finally closing a gate. He leaned in and said near my ear, Clara, we can also move on the cabin in a second lane. Her pencil hovered. You told me Ruth had you signed something for the property after the second winter there. A precaution in case either of you died. Her eyes were careful. I shook my head, then nodded slowly as a smell arrived. Sharp as if memory has a pantry. Damp cedar, fish oil, the mineral tang of lake water when the wind drags it across old boards. We went to a bank in town with a mural of a logging camp. I said, Ruth made me sign a thing so the cabin would pass. Clean. My throat worked. She said she wanted the doc to hold grandkids without lawyers. It had been a joke then. It wasn't now. She whispered, delighted by a new wire to pull. Clara, that would be a transfer on death deed or a life estate with remainder. If so, your son never owned a shadow of it. She looked at Flora. Words passed between them without sound. The kind of fluency born of women who have had to build their own radio to get men to hear them. He slammed his hand on the bench rail twice. Judge Manetti, we'll take a recess for 10 minutes so counsel can make their calls. He pointed his pen like a conductor finding brass. Banker doesn't leave the building. Notary either. Brookside administrator can wait in the second row, and try not to look like a policy memo in a cardigan. He faced me. Mr. Carter, don't go far. It was almost kind. I lowered my voice to Evan as the room rustled into motion. You did good, I told him. He stared at his shoes like boys do when praise makes them taller too fast. The mortarboard itched. He kept it on anyway. She didn't blink as she said, sliding beside us with the aroma of copier toner and peppermint gum. The recorder's deputy. I pulled microfilm from 98, she announced. Life estate deed. Grantors Harlan and Ruth Carter. Remainder to grandson named in a separate instrument upon completion of secondary education. She grinned. That's today. She slid the copy into Claire's hands. We don't usually run this fast, but my mother is in a place like Brookside and I am tired of children who think help means holding a pen to their parent's hand. He leaned in and said from 2 pews behind, a battered man in a union cap I didn't know. Judge, let the boy open it. He pointed with a gnarled finger. If there's a sealed instrument, graduation is the condition. Ain't it? Let's see a thing go right for once. The room hummed. Courts listen to humming when they remember who pays their lights. I shook my head, overwhelmed not by the legal win but by the precise kindness of my dead wife, who had anticipated our softest spot and braced it with paper. The texture of her handwriting on the photocopy felt like skin even through the ink. She whispered into the judge's ear. Flores, with the economy of someone who uses time like a scalpel. We have a condition precedent met today, Your Honor. The instrument is in a safe deposit box at River First Bank. Branch manager confirms they can bring the envelope under escort in 15. She showed him her phone with the text from a number labeled Branch River First, whose grammar had the stress of a person typing fast and honest. He slammed his hand on his gavel once. We reconvene in 20, he ordered. Bailiff, coordinate with River First. Counsel, stop posturing and start stipulating. If there is a remainder in the grandson, I am not letting this get delayed because someone enjoys billing the word continuance. I lowered my voice to Jerry as we waited in the hall. The courthouse corridor smelled like coffee, fear, and floor polish. I can hear Ruth laugh, I said. He bumped my shoulder with his. She's got that laugh that says you were an idiot yesterday and a genius today, he said. That woman taught me to add a shim where men like to swing harder. She didn't blink as she said from the end of the hall. The Brookside administrator, Mr. Carter, we only ever wanted your safety. Her cardigan had pills near the cuff from nervously twisting it. Our notes reflect concern. Your friend Jerry signed out of hours. He leaned in and said, voice like a plumber reading a bid. Jerry, lady, I signed a maintenance log. I don't sedate people to make them easier to chart. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Dignity can be a sledgehammer when it lands right. I shook my head and looked past them to a display case full of black and white photos of ribbon cuttings and groundbreakings. Half the men in those photos wore hats, And all of them wore the same set jaw that says they've argued with weather and won enough times to forget humility. I checked mine in the glass. It looked like a man who had stopped letting other people narrate him. She whispered from my other side. Claire, reading a quick email. The bank's compliance officer just replied. All to something he shouldn't have, he says, quote, in light of today's public disclosures in the AG's presence, cease all activity on Carter-related nominee accounts until further instruction. Her eyebrow lifted. Nominee accounts. Plural. He slammed his hand on his pocket to quiet a vibrating phone. Nathan, color gone. His whisper hissed into his cuff. Delete that thread, he ordered, forgetting that email is a river that laughs at sandbags. I lowered my voice to Evan. You are your grandmother's remainder, I said. He blinked. We'll translate later, he answered, mouth twitching into the smile of a boy who has carried more adult weight this week than he should. The bailiff returned with a small gray bank pouch. Sealed. Initials in blue on the tape. River First Cents. Branch manager came with him. Breath high, tie askew. Face the color of a person who has realized their institution has been borrowed by wolves. We logged chain of custody, he babbled. We called counsel. We stopped because the judge had entered. He leaned in and said, controlled. On the record. The clerk's fingers found their machine. The room remembered how to sit. We have before us a sealed instrument retrieved from River First, pursuant to the court's directive. Mr. Carter, do you recognize the handwriting on the envelope? I shook my head, which is how you say yes without sounding like a man built only from sentiment. Ruth's, I said. She writes her all like a chair with one leg short. She didn't blink as she said from counsel table. Clara, we stipulate to authenticity subject to later forensic review if opposing insists. Opposing did not insist. Opposing was busy trying not to sweat through silk. He slammed his hand lightly to settle the envelope. Judge Minetti's fingers hovered above the seal. Before I open this, he said, let's resolve the simple. He turned to my son. Keys. Now. The word now had a ballast that only bench years give. My son hesitated, then reached into his pocket. The key ring chimed. He placed it on the rail where metal met wood with a tiny final music. I lowered my voice because triumph needs a lid. We'll change the locks, I said, but thank you. He didn't meet my eyes. He looked at nothing. Nothing looked back. She didn't blink as she said, Flora. And the Brookside order. The judge nodded. Brookside is enjoined from administering any sedative to Mr. Carter absent documented medical necessity, unrelated to behavioral convenience. Administrator. Acknowledge. The cardigan bob. The note entered the record with a weight that for once felt like protection rather than paperweight. He leaned in and said like a man rolling a prayer between finger and thumb, Pastor Dell, I would like to apologize to Mr. Carter for my earlier letter. His voice was that of a person who had once told jokes at potlucks and now preferred silence. I forgot that compassion without facts is a costume. He sat. I let the apology land, then allowed it to keep walking past me toward a month from now when I could decide if it mattered. I shook my head when the notary tried to stand. Sit, the judge told her, and she did, as if the word was spelled in stone. The envelope waited. The room leaned in without moving. She didn't blink as she said, barely above a breath, Clara, ready? Her hand hovered near mine like the old days when Ruth would thread a needle for me because big fingers can't ask eyelets to be generous. He slammed his hand down once. The judge just a firm connection to the surface, like a man telling time that it answers to him, not the other way. We will now open the instrument, he announced. I lowered my voice to my grandson, because whatever was inside was about to redraw maps. Whatever it says, I told him. We walk out together. He nodded. His tassel brushed my shoulder. He smelled like product and effort, and the bright anxiety of a day too full. She didn't blink as she said in a voice that could have been my wife's if memory were a ventriloquist. The past speaking through paper, to be opened when the tassel turns. The judge slid a letter opener under the seal. It made a sound like a zipper tugged through a new jacket. He drew out a single-page document. Cream paper. Ruth's hand marching across it in lines that sloped uphill as if even her words insisted on climbing. He began to read. And at the second sentence, before anyone could understand whether Ruth had given the lake to a future or drawn a map to something we hadn't thought to look for, 3 phones buzzed in a row at counsel table like a tremor finding the surface. Flores looked down. Clara looked down. Even the judge's clerk, who had mastered the art of ignoring everything, went pale. An alert glowed on the screens, the kind that only hits when systems speak to systems. River First Bank. Unusual activity: cashier's checks issued from Carter nominee accounts. Destination: out-of-state escrow. My son didn't move, but Nathan did, hand inching toward his briefcase as if paper could turn into legs. Deputy Raines stood. "Mr. Preston," Flores said, voice flat as a stop sign. "Where exactly do you think you're going?" Flores didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The word questions had more authority in her mouth than most men manage with badges. He leaned in and said toward the aisle, "The banker trying for casual. Compliance needs me downstairs." His hand slid the briefcase an inch. His eyes cut to the door in a calculation that forgot he was doing math in a room full of people who hate shortcuts. I shook my head and watched Raines move like a man who doesn't waste steps. The deputy reached the door faster than fear. He planted himself where the hinge would swing, a fixed point in a world that liked to call itself fluid when it wanted to escape. She whispered, Claire at my shoulder, "We can stop a cashier's check before it's negotiated if the court orders the bank to interplead and hold. We need a fast freeze." Her finger tapped the exhibit list like a machinist measuring tolerances. He slammed his hand open in a gesture that asked for calm and got obedience. Judge Minetti. On the state's motion and petitioner's joinder, all instruments issued from any Carter-related nominee or trust accounts in the last 72 hours are enjoined from presentment, negotiation, or transfer. River First shall hold funds in suspense and appear to explain itself within 7 days. He turned to the banker. "Mr. Preston, take a seat. If you stand again without my invitation, bring a toothbrush." I lowered my voice and felt the old hum in my chest settle. Work had begun. Paper was now a tool, not just a story other people tried to write over mine. "Your Honor," I said, "I'd like to hear my wife." The envelope waited like a door we had finally found the right key for. She didn't blink as she said, "Proceed." The clerk's fingers hovered. The room leaned without shifting. The judge returned to Ruth's letter and read, "Harlan, if you're hearing this, you've kept walking. Good." The courtroom air changed temperature. "Evan, if your tassel is brushing your ear, congratulations. The cabin will belong to you today. If you still want fish scales on your shoes and a dock that remembers every boot, Harlan keeps a life estate as long as breath is honest. If anyone, friendkin or man in a tie, uses a paper to push you both out, give this to a woman named Clara. She understands the kind of fairness that can lift a waterlogged boat back onto a trailer without cracking the keel." He leaned in and said with something like a prayer stuck sideways in his throat, "Pastor Dell." Eyes wet. Ruth always wrote like a woman who meant to build with words. No one argued. Even the district counsel pretended to study his pen. I shook my head and let Ruth's hand keep walking across the page in the judge's voice. "Harlan and Sons was never a promise to one son," the letter read. It meant every hand that held a flashlight steady. "The company's blue truck and tools belong to a community trust upon my death. The trust purpose is apprentices. Kids who want to turn wrenches and leave kitchens cleaner than they found them. Evan, if you want a place there, you always have one. Our son will have a place too when he remembers the difference between help and harvest," she whispered, almost smiling. "She put you all in the same sentence and made it a path." Claire's hand touched the table once, the way you touch a beam to feel if it can carry. He slammed his hand flat to still his shaking. "My son, she wrote that years ago," he protested, like time itself could serve as a solvent. "She didn't know." I lowered my voice. "She knew us," I said, "better than we did." She didn't blink as she said, Flores with the last paragraph in sight, "There is a sealed line here." She glanced at me. "Permission?" I nodded. The judge read, "To the one who will try to rush money out the back door while everyone is clapping at a graduation, don't. Harlan taught me the sound of water hammers. I know what a sudden knock in a pipe means. It means you forgot there's pressure on the line." The letter ended with Ruth's small drawn heart, that she used to sign grocery lists when she wanted to make the mundane feel like hours. Silence wasn't the right word for the thing that settled. It was more like a room choosing not to lie to itself anymore. He leaned in and said through clenched teeth, "Nathan, Judge, my firm will cooperate." His mouth formed the word cooperate, the way a cat pretends to enjoy baths. I shook my head. "Good," I said. "Start by telling the truth." She whispered to the record, "Flores. The state requests referral of the notary to licensing, referral of River First to banking, and preservation of all communications for potential charges." He slammed his hand on his pad. "Minetti. Granted. Temporary orders extended. Keys surrendered." He looked at me for the first time like a man seeing another man instead of a file. "Mr. Carter, I'm not often in the business of righting wrongs in one afternoon. Don't get used to it." But today we'll try to keep water where it belongs. I lowered my voice. Understood. The word fit my mouth like an old socket that still catches. She didn't blink as she said to Brookside's administrator, "You'll discharge Mr. Carter today and you'll like it." Clara added under her breath as we gathered. Then louder, "You'll send the ombudsman all restraint records for the last 6 months." The cardigan tremble policy had finally met consequences. He leaned in and said at my elbow, "Evan, Grandpa, we going home?" The boy in his voice and the man in his eyes shared the same space for the first time without arguing. I shook my head once, not a refusal, but a recalibration. "We're going to the house first," I said. Then she whispered to Flores as we left, "Thank you." The AG didn't smile. She nodded the way a person nods when there's always another file. We stepped into heat that had cooked the courthouse steps to a smell like hot pennies. Reporters waited with microphones in hands that had learned how to be steady on deadline. I had no taste for cameras. But ceremony had found us again, whether I liked it or not. He leaned in and said, one of them, "Mr. Carter, do you have a statement?" His tie was crooked in a way that made him more honest than the others. I shook my head and faced the lens anyway. "If you love someone," I said, "don't hand a banker a pen and call it care. Learn the paperwork yourself, or find someone who knows how to hold a light while you read." The microphones caught it. The crowd murmured. Somewhere, a mother texted a daughter the line in a chain that would outlive my voice. She whispered, "Night nurse at my side out of nowhere, like good luck. I'm coming to help you pack." I laughed once. "Short, bring the good tape," I told her. "We're not labeling anything miscellaneous ever again." He slammed his hand on the hood of Jerry's truck to get our attention. My son, flanked now by a lawyer with color back in his cheeks, and courage borrowed from retainer fees. "Dad," he called, the word heavy again. "Please, we can fix this in private. You're making it." I lowered my voice. "I lived your private," I answered. "We'll work in daylight a while." She didn't blink as she said, clear enough for the parking lot to keep Clara. "You'll get a calendar invite for the hearing on sanctions. Forward it to counsel who can tell you what that means." We drove with windows down because the truck's AC was a wish, and because the wind felt like soap. The neighborhood changed microphones for sprinklers. Kids ran through arcs of water that caught the sun and made halos without asking permission. He leaned in and said at the curb, Jerry pointing his chin at my old porch, "We do locks first." He pulled a tool roll out from behind the seat, and it breathed oil and leather, and the promise of problems that would actually yield to hands. I shook my head at the new patio set, then smiled at the old scuff on the threshold where Ruth used to bump her hip. It hadn't been sanded out. Time leaves fingerprints where malice forgets to wipe. She whispered, Evan at my shoulder, "Key?" I placed the brass on the ribbon into his palm. He slid it into the lock. It turned with a sound that lives in a man's bones. If he has ever owned anything honestly. The door opened. The house exhaled. He slammed his hand gently against the door jamb the way you greet a friend. "Smells like lemons," Jerry said, "and home under it." That part's still there. I lowered my voice and crossed to the counter. My hand found the groove where Ruth's cutting board had sat for 29 years. The wood had memory. Mine did too. "Trash bags under the sink," I said. "If we find any papers with my signature after last fall, they go in a box for Clara. Nothing else leaves." She didn't blink as she said from the doorway, "My daughter-in-law, no entourage now, just a person who had run out of audience. You can't just take over." He leaned in and said without heat, Rains, who had followed at a distance and now stood like a quiet fence, "Court said he can." I shook my head and kept moving. Photos had been rearranged to tell a story where I had been a guest actor. I put Ruth's apron back on the hook by the pantry door. I set my father's level on the windowsill where it had caught afternoon light for 20 years. "Small sovereignty, the right tools in the right place," she whispered, coming close without a camera as armor. I was scared. My daughter-in-law's lower lip trembled like a confession. "Rehearsed too long. He said you were falling. He said we'd lose everything if we didn't act." He slammed his hand on the table between us once, open-palmed. "My son, don't apologize to him," he snapped at her. And for the first time in months I heard the boy whose knees I'd bandaged. He always got louder when his fear met a corner. I lowered my voice. "You both tell receipts more secrets than you ever told me," I said. "That's your generation's religion. Keep your faith if it comforts you. But don't build an altar in my kitchen with my name as the sacrifice." She didn't blink as she said, barely audible, "We'll leave." She took his hand. He resisted. Then he didn't. They walked out past the maple we planted when he was born. The rope swing creaked. It sounded like a decision that might hold. We changed the locks. We boxed the mail. We left the door open while we worked. Because I wanted the house to learn our voices again. When the sun swung low enough that it got serious about color, we loaded the truck and drove north. He leaned in and said over the wind, "Jerry, haven't been to the lake since the year the dam broke." His smile found a story and told it. We fished nails out of the dock with a magnet. Remember? We did. The magnet had been Ruth's idea. She had laughed when it returned with treasures that didn't belong to us. I shook my head and let the road unwind. The trees on County 12 smelled like hot sap and the kind of dust that tastes like childhood if you grew up near gravel. Evan hung his arm out the window and let his hand surf the air. She whispered when the water came into view. Ruth in my ear again, or I was telling myself a story I could walk on. Slow down. Don't waste the shore by arriving fast. He slammed his hand on the dash in joy when the cabin appeared. Evan. It's smaller than I remembered, he said, stepping out. And better. I lowered my voice, standing at the edge of the dock. The boards flexed exactly the way they always had when the lake breathed. Your grandmother left you the remainder. I told him. That means the future is yours as long as you make room for old men who still know where the nails stick up. She didn't blink as she said into the evening. The water itself answering in small slaps on wood. Deal. Evan grinned and toed off his shoes. He dangled his feet into water that had met 1,000 ankles, and never forgot any of them. We grilled hot dogs that tasted like a decision to be ordinary on purpose. Jerry found a radio in the shed that still pulled in a game from 2 towns over. The night nurse. Her name is Renee. And I had finally asked sat on the steps and told us how her father won a tractor in a raffle the year the county fair forgot to buy insurance. We laughed too loud for the loons and they forgave us. He leaned in and said near the fire, Evan holding the letter again. Read the last line, Grandpa. He handed the page to me like a baton. I shook my head once for courage, and then read the sentence Ruth had tucked at the bottom, almost as if she had known that a night like this needed something to hold. A house is a tool, she had written. So is a family. Don't let either become a trophy. She whispered from the dark edge of the water. That's enough for tonight. The waves agreed. You can hear agreement if you listen with your wrists. He slammed his hand on his graduate cap, which he had insisted on wearing to the dock as if to prove a point to the lake. The tassel fell into his eyes. He laughed, and I laughed, and the sound made room for sleep in a way morphine never did. I lowered my voice for the part of the story you tell, only once. I forgive you, kid, I said to the empty space where my son would stand if he ever decided to show with his hands empty of excuses. The door isn't locked, but it isn't your house anymore. The wind carried it toward the trees, which are better at keeping confidences than people. She didn't blink as she said, in a text from Flores that arrived as stars started to insist on being seen. Bank froze the checks. Notary under investigation. Hearing set for sanctions Friday. Sleep. I put the phone face down. The lake doesn't need backlight. We slept hard and woke easy. Morning smelled like wet wood and coffee. Evan took the skiff out and came back with a perch he treated like a jewel. We threw it back because we weren't hungry for that kind of proof anymore. He leaned in and said as he wrapped the blue ribbon around a nail in the beam, Evan, we should leave this here. So every time we unlock the door we remember ceremony belongs to us, if we show up prepared. He stood back. The ribbon made the kitchen look brave. I shook my head at how simple right can be when it stops auditioning for applause. Let's write the apprentice fund charter this week, I said. First scholarship in your grandmother's name. Tools, not trophies. She whispered across the water. The world itself, if you live long enough to hear it. Hold to what holds you. We drove back to town in the afternoon for one last errand. Brookside's lobby had a bulletin board with flyers for chair yoga and a photo of a therapy dog who looked bored with kindness. I signed my discharge. Renee hugged me without making it a scene. The administrator signed papers with a pen that had stopped pretending to be important. He slammed his hand on the counter, not angry, celebratory. Jerry, I stole you a muffin, he said. If they ask, tell them I'm the maintenance department, which I am, in a metaphysical sense. I shook my head and took the lemon poppy seed anyway. It tasted like a thing made by hands. I left a box of donuts for the night shift with a note for the people who remember names. She didn't blink as she said when we crossed the threshold to the parking lot. Sun clean and blunt. You did it. Clara met us at the curb with a stack of fresh certified copies and a smile the size of a lifeboat. Now we keep it done. We went home, not to a facility, not to a court, to a house that fit again. I hung my wrench on the pegboard. Ruth painted blue. Evan put his diploma on the mantel next to a photo of his grandmother holding a stringer of fish like a victory banner. I set the ledger, the public and the private one, on the shelf by the door where I keep the things I don't forget. There's one more thing. It's small and it's everything. He leaned in and said on our first quiet night, Evan at the table with a pencil tucked behind his ear, "Can I put in grandson on the truck?" He didn't look at me. He looked at the window where his reflection tried on the word. I shook my head at the phrasing and then nodded at the idea. "Harlan and Hans?" I said. "Let anyone who steadies a light belong." She whispered, the part of me that still hears Ruth when boards creak. "That'll hold." The phone vibrated once with a new email from the court. Sanctions hearing noticed. My son sees. The subject line dry as toast. I turned the phone face down again. Some things can wait for daylight. We ate soup. We listened to the radio. We argued about whether the twins would ever fix their bullpen. We let the house teach us its night noises again so none of them sounded like danger. We were ordinary on purpose, which is its own kind of revenge when people expected you to crumble into theater. I took the blue ribbon key off my neck and hung it on the hook by the door. For a second my hand stayed there, unsure of how to be empty. Then it learned. Hands do, if you keep giving them honest work. When I turned off the kitchen light, the windows held the lakes dark like a promise. I could smell pine faint and clean all the way from here, and that was enough. If this story struck a chord, hit like, subscribe, and tell me what you think in the comments.